Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
Hey everyone, welcome into another episode of the Ducks Unlimited podcast. We are excited today to bring you an update from the prairies. As most folks will know by now, we do not have the May breeding population and habitat survey from which to get periodic updates from people actually out in the field that are doing that survey on kind of what we're seeing with respect to habitat conditions and bird numbers. So lacking that information, we're going to make a commitment to trying to reach out to our field staff, both within the States and in Canada, to give us some on-the-ground updates of what they're seeing. Not going to be quite the same as what we could have gotten from the survey, but we're going to fill the gap nevertheless with some good reports from our field folks. So first up today, on this episode, we have joining us a friend of the show, someone who joined us last year for a similar type report, Dr. Scott Stevens, the Ducks Unlimited Canada's Director of Regional Operations for the Prairie and Boreal. Scott, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here and visit with you.
I think last year we made the comment that your episode, your habitat report from 2019 was the most downloaded episode that we had. So again, we're going to kind of hold you to that standard. And I think the last time you said that your mom was largely responsible for all those downloads, so you might need to reach out to her again and put her on notice. Let her know we're going to be serving this up to the masses here pretty soon.
Right. Okay. I will do that.
Scott, just to kind of get started, I wanted to check in with you on a Ducks Unlimited Canada kind of report. I know with the COVID-19 situation, we're all doing things differently. We've had survey cancellations, all sorts of other field work has been hindered, but just wanted to get an update from DU Canada there. Are y'all back in the office yet, or are y'all still working largely out of your homes?
Yeah, almost all of our staff are working out of their homes now. I don't think we have anybody left in offices, and that's really been the case for us since about the middle of March. So the good news is I'll give credit to our IT department. They had us set up on Microsoft Teams, and we were really locked and loaded to work remotely before we needed to, and that was a good thing in this case. I don't think they saw a pandemic coming, but they were moving us to that platform anyway. So everybody's been able to be pretty productive and keep things rolling. Our folks who do work in the field, they've managed to keep all that rolling, which is really important. If we'd be in have much bigger challenges to deal with if we weren't able to do the stuff in the field. But, our staff are out there surveying and doing wetland restoration and grassland restoration right now. They're able to do that by, maintaining social distancing and, out in the fresh air. I think they're probably safer doing that than they would be sitting in an office. So all good on that front.
Well, that's good to hear. It's largely the same here in the States. A lot of our offices are still closed. Some are starting to reopen, consistent with whatever the state or region-specific kind of guidelines are permitting. But yeah, I think most everyone in the States is still working out of their homes. We do have a lot of field staff that are continuing to deliver conservation projects, that are continuing to design and seek funding for conservation projects. So there are big portions of the organization that are rocking and rolling, and but all while following the guidelines as appropriate. So just wanted to get a quick update on that. Thank you for sharing. And yeah, like everyone, we hope things get back to normal sooner rather than later. And I think we're trending in the right direction. But for now, for the sake of this conversation, I wanted to shift a bit to talk about waterfowl habitat conditions and maybe a bit about what you're seeing in terms of bird numbers. I do know that you've been able to get out in the field a time or two. I think some of it was just for your own personal recreation, but you also have I think a decent handle, have some contacts throughout the province of Manitoba that you might have been able to check in with. And so we just wanted to get your report on, as you see it, and realizing this is just one person's characterization of what you're seeing, maybe what you're hearing. It's not as comprehensive as a survey. But nevertheless, kind of what are you seeing? What can you tell hunters across North America with respect to Manitoba?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll back up and say, really the kind of snowpack conditions that we have coming into early March dictates, at least to start with, what conditions are going to be like across the prairies. And fortunately, that's a data source that we still had available to us this year, despite surveys not happening weekly. Environment and Climate Change Canada, they produce a snowpack map for the prairie provinces. And so I get that update weekly, and I have the map from like the end of the first week of March up in front of me. And I think that is probably one of the best sources we have of, here's sort of a good index to what runoff was going to be from snowpack. And, that's usually the most important thing that fills wetland basins and that kind of thing. So as I look at that map, really, the way I'd simplify it is the parkland areas, kind of in the northern fringe of the Prairie Pothole region. There was pretty good snowpack in March there, and there was runoff, and so we will have water there. As you move into sort of the prairie areas, as we get out of those aspen parklands and you move south, it was pretty dry. Like the snowpack equivalent in this map is in millimeters, and basically they had 10 millimeters or a centimeter of snowpack across the southern prairies for the most part. A little bit more in Manitoba than in Alberta and Saskatchewan, but not much. So the prairies, the true prairies are fairly dry, and I would say we have not had any significant precipitation events since then to really change that. I know here we've had, some light rain that turned the grass green, but nothing that was going to run off into the wetland basin. So, I would say really those southern areas in the prairies are going to be pretty dry, and there isn't going to be, a lot of activity there. The parklands are going to be okay. So, that's not an uncommon trend. Those parkland areas have trees because they typically get more precipitation on an annual basis than do those prairie areas. So that's kind of where things stand right now. Now if we can get big rains, and that can change things and add water, but in the middle of May, where we are now, at least for early nesting species, things aren't going to change much. Species that are a little later to nest, like gadwall and scaup and some of those things, the clouds could burst tomorrow and we could fill up a bunch of wetland basins. But, the reality is those species are not really keen into shallow water anyway. They're using more permanent water or deeper ponds. And so, the parkland's going to be pretty good. The prairie's pretty dry. And so, that I would say sets us up to have kind of, a rather mediocre potential for production.
It sounds a fair bit the way we might have described it last year. Is that, am I hearing things correctly?
Yeah, I think that is true. And in fact, Mike, as I was pulling up that map, I had the same kind of map from last year, and it does look very similar. So,
yeah.
Similar to conditions to what we had last year coming out in the early spring.
Yeah. And I think those similarities are probably going to bear out across the border as well. I know we're going to try to line up some folks from North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana here over the coming weeks. But I think the general consensus, everything I'm hearing, and hearing it pretty loudly in some cases, is that North and South Dakota are pretty doggone wet. I'm not sure about Montana, but do I remember correctly, Scott? And I think you'd have a handle on this. There was flooding in the Red River in North Dakota again this year, wasn't that? Do I have that right?
Yeah, there was definitely a little bit. I definitely saw some pictures on Facebook of I-29 that runs through that Red River Valley corridor having water over the top of it. It didn't last for long, so But yeah, that's consistent with the reports that I've heard. Is especially South Dakota was really wet last year, and that's carried over and continued. And I think North Dakota is in at least okay shape. You'll get better intel from some of those folks down there. But once you get across the border here, it's pretty dry in the prairies. The parklands have some water, but yeah, that's, like I said, that's not an uncommon situation. And, usually when we have that kind of situation, it'll not be great production on our side of the border. And I think, that sort of cascades into other impacts that people see in your part of the world in the fall. It's like, well, if we get winter and we have ducks, there are ducks here, but man, they're hard to work. And it's like, yep, lots of adult birds in the population, not many juveniles. That's the recipe.
That's right. And I would imagine in just about every year that we do this kind of a survey or have a conversation about habitat conditions on the prairies, we're gonna talk about some level of regional variation, how it's super wet here and it's really dry here, and it's it's kind of okay here, and that just it goes to reinforce the importance of working across the entire landscape. You can even think about it as a portfolio, and you're investing in this portfolio to generate ducks. That would be the currency that we're trying to produce here, and all the other benefits that come from it. But the fact that conditions are rarely good across an entire landscape, and that most of the times you're going to have one area that's good and one area that's bad, just emphasizes the importance of working in all of those areas so that you have a diversified approach and that you can take advantage of those favorable environmental conditions wherever they may occur across this broader landscape during any given year. And that's, again, what we're seeing now, generally dry in the prairies, very wet in the Dakotas, and kind of mediocre to good, maybe up in the parklands.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I know, Mike, you've seen some of those graphics that we have showing how water moves around that whole, the whole prairie pothole region through time. And yeah, you can definitely find years where it's sopping wet in Canada and fairly dry in the Dakotas, and vice versa. And that's exactly the philosophy that we have, is we have to have all of those areas intact and functioning when the right environmental conditions exist, or it's just like having part of your factory out of production if you lose the capacity for those areas to turn on when they have the right environmental conditions. So that's something that from a habitat standpoint we're really focused on, making sure that when we get the right snowfall or rain, the basins are there, the grassland habitat's there to sort of, set the stage for birds to take advantage. Unfortunately, we don't control the weather. If I did, I probably wouldn't be talking to you right now. But
just being honest, I appreciate it.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
But Scott, I also find it interesting, whatever you were talking about, the map that you go to, your go-to map for trying to anticipate spring wetland conditions is snowpack, kind of coming into the spring. And there's no shortage of meteorological maps that you can get from various web services, both in Canada and the U.S. And one of those, of course, relates to drought conditions. And if you look at the drought conditions in the prairies, there's not much indication of a drought. And so we actually had an exchange on Facebook, maybe it was a couple of weeks ago, where someone had posted a map about doesn't look like there's any drought in the prairies. Maybe that's a good thing. And you're like, well, I wouldn't get too carried away, because it's some of these other more short term, or some of these other ways of characterizing meteorological conditions, moisture conditions that are going to have a stronger bearing on what actually plays out in terms of those spring wetland conditions. And so I was excited to hear you talk about that, the snowpack coming out of winter into spring as being a pretty key determinant of the way you would anticipate wetland conditions shaping up. So that was helpful and informative for me. What are you seeing? I know you were out at Delta Marsh last week. Birds are showing up rapidly, left and right. I guess they've already been there some species have already been there for a month or so. Are you able to? Is this at the level that we're able to perceive just with our eyes? It's probably not very easy to notice, small changes, 10 or 20% change. It's only in these drastic changes in abundances of birds that we're able really to perceive it. But are you noticing anything with respect to the birds you're seeing this year? Just wanted to kind of make sure I asked that question.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe the first thing that I noticed, and this is kind of a sign of the times, I got out there and it's like, hey, look, the birds are still doing their thing. They seem to be unaffected by all this craziness that the rest of us have going on in our lives. So that was a bit comforting, I'll admit. It's like, oh yeah, I showed up and was walking around with the dog and flushed a lone drake mallard off a pond. And it's like, all right, well, that means there's a hen somewhere sitting on eggs doing her thing. And
so he wasn't, that's not an indication of that drake mallard social distancing then.
Well, it's interesting. I did think about that term. And it's like, ducks have been doing social distancing in the springtime for forever because they're territorial.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, they're like, hey, this is my space staked out for my hen to get her invertebrate resources that she needs to lay eggs. You other pairs of mallards stay the heck away. So there is social distancing going on, but it's not related to COVID.
Yeah. But all the birds have, I think all the species have gotten there. I think I saw a video of some blue wings that are on the prairies, and they're actively in courtship mode. At least some of them are. Those that are still trying to find a mate. But any stragglers? Anything still showing up in good numbers?
I would say I haven't seen ruddy ducks yet, but they're a late nesting species. They're forming pairs once they get here. So I suspect that there are a few around. I just haven't encountered them yet. We should have the full complement here. And I'll admit, where I was at Delta Marsh is kind of outside of the true glaciated pothole country. It's more permanent water and in that marsh. So it's a little bit different, conditions. It's a really important fall staging area, but birds breed there, but not a ton of birds breed there. So, you see a few birds doing their thing, but, unfortunately, I have not been out to real pothole country to drive around and take a look at things. I know that Dr. Mike Anderson, one of our retired emeritus scientists, was out there running some surveys, some roadside surveys for canvasbacks that he's been working on for north of 40 years. And he said in that Minnedosa area where he had done that work on canvasbacks, things looked pretty good for canvasbacks. So I think that's one of the nuances that many times we miss when we're trying to communicate to people is, what conditions are like, and you can look at drought maps, but it really depends on kind of the species that you're talking about. Canvasbacks that use more semi-permanent wetlands, they can withstand drought better than some of the dabbling ducks that are taking advantage of, shallow water that's running off in the snowmelt. Those semi-permanent wetlands can carry water over from the previous year and be fine. So, it's nuanced like many of the things that we deal with, are. And, I guess the main reason I look at that snowpack map is that tells me mostly about dabbling ducks. So mallards, pintails, blue wings, shovelers, gadwall, maybe a little bit less gadwall than the others that I mentioned there. But we know that they really do well when we have what I would call fresh water that's run off from snow and filled up basins that were maybe dry the previous year. We know that, those wetlands have to go through that dry period to really reset the stage and recycle nutrients. And then when they get wet again, man, there's this flush of productivity. So those are the kind of conditions that we know really, really cause booms in productivity of, invertebrate resources, and ducks take advantage. And, usually when we're coming out of those dry periods, there's sort of a bump in nesting success too. We think what happens is that predator populations probably decline because things have been dry and food isn't super abundant for them either. And then the water comes back, and man, the ducks, show up on their little wings, and they're able to take advantage. And it takes a little while for the predators to catch back up. So, when I think of dabbling ducks, that's why I'm looking at snowpack, but it definitely is sort of a nuanced story as you get deeper into the weeds on all of this stuff.
I appreciate you mentioning Dr. Mike Anderson continuing to do his survey work out there in Minnedosa. I actually had seen a post or saw a comment of his that made me realize that he was actually out there this year doing those surveys, and the thought crossed my mind at that time that I need to get him on the podcast to discuss what he's seeing. More to the point of what you're really talking about is it does depend on the species, and there may be some even smaller scale patterns of habitat conditions that certainly in these general conversations we can't pick up on. So we will try over the next few months to speak with different people from different locations. I'm trying to line something up with a DU Canada biologist or staffer in Saskatchewan. Will probably connect with several different people across that province just to get different perspectives. Things can change through time. Things are certainly different across space in this vast landscape. So we'll try to keep in touch with various people in various locations throughout the summer, trying to fill some of that void that is going to be there because we're not going to have that broad scale survey data on habitat conditions that we traditionally get. Now, we won't be able to answer a whole lot with respect to bird numbers from auxiliary data sets that we can, to some extent get with respect to habitat conditions. Go into the snowpack data set that you're referencing. There's not really much alternative out there when it comes to bird numbers. I do think North Dakota was conducting their survey, and we'll try to get some of that information on and out to our listeners. But it sounds like in the prairies of Canada and the parklands, we are in a condition that's fairly similar to where we were this time last year. And so it certainly could be better, certainly could be worse. So we'll just keep an eye on things. We'll hope for a little bit more precipitation and be pulling for the ducks throughout the summer. So Scott, I do appreciate you joining us and spending some time with us. Any final words for the folks?
Well, I would just say, Mike, that, you talked about the fact that we don't have the survey this year. I guess the piece of advice that I'd offer to folks listening is, I don't think we should panic about that. It had been a long-term survey that we'd been collecting, every year for 60 some years. So it's too bad we have a little break in that, but, it's not like ducks are going to drop off the edge of a cliff here because we don't have that data. And, the changes year to year are usually not that great. And we'd be aware based on the habitat conditions if we were going to see a big change. And, like we talked about, not a lot different from last year. So probably not going to be big swings in the populations either. So, we like to have that information, but I'd say, there's no 3-alarm fire that we're all freaked out because, of the current situation where we won't have it this year.
Yep, I totally agree, and thanks for sharing your perspective on that. We're actually trying to get Dr. Ken Richkus, the chief of the Division of Migratory Bird Management, on an episode so we can talk about that decision and talk about some of the things that you just mentioned there, the long-term nature of the data that we do have and kind of what their decision was. And so we hope to be bringing that to our listeners as well. So we do have a lot of things that we're trying to line up. And so we thank folks for tuning in. And Scott, we thank you for being an important part of that and hope to reconnect with you sometime later in the summer as we can get an update on late spring, early summer habitat conditions. Would you be up for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to join again and sort of give you the update.
All right. Thanks, Scott. We'll talk to you later.
Okay, sounds good.
A special thanks to our guest on today's show, Dr. Scott Stevens with Ducks Unlimited Canada. We appreciate his insights from the field, and we hope to be bringing more information from him and other folks throughout the summer. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great job that he does editing these podcasts and serving them up to you, our listeners, and to you, our listeners, of course, the most important part of this venture. We thank you for your time. We thank you for spending it with us, and we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment for wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.